So shall we begin?
Okay.
If there's any background noise where you are, or if you're going to do any sort of side talking, I just really want to encourage you to be on mute so that it's not disturbing for everyone. And Jerry, why don't you take us away?
Right. This is Act 2 of our Dog and Pony show. I thought it would be helpful for me just for a few minutes to recap what we talked about last time. Is it now appropriate, you think, Sharon, for me to put up? Let me see if I can do this. No, I know what I want to do. Here it is. I'm going to put something in chat, which might help, okay? Type the message here. There should appear in your chat now a document. It's not very well formulated, unfortunately, because it's just in the chat. But it covers what we used as a kind of scaffolding for our discussion last time. I've added a fifth problem. The first problem is what I'll call the text problem, and that is, how do we read this text responsibly and attributing to it its own integrity, as opposed to spinning it in some way or other. There are four key problems in approaching this difficult text. One is, I call
Jerry,
it
if I can interrupt you,
Yeah,
I don't
please.
think it got into the chat. So if
it didn't, chat.
There we go.
Wait a minute.
There we go.
How's that?
I just put it in there for you.
Okay, we got it. I didn't hit enter. That's the problem. Thank you. So the theological problem you can sum up this way. What do we learn about God from this? Or what must God be like in order for the events of the Akedah to take place? I call it the knowledge problem, but the problem is, what did Abraham actually know? Did he get it right? The third problem, and I call it the faith problem, and that is, what does faith or devotion to God require, and was Abraham faithful? And the moral problem, the last one, is, didn't Abraham really fully intend to murder? That is, to do a great wrong. And how can that be justified? So those are the four problems we dealt with. I opened with a brief discussion of the Reformed, that is, that element of the Protestant tradition, reading of it in John Calvin's commentary on Genesis 22. Calvin presented, thought that what happens here is that God presents Abraham with a challenge to his faith, an utter deep challenge to his faith, because both the covenant promise and the command were God's word. And yet Abraham was to understand God's full covenant faithfulness, not just to Abraham, but to all humanity. The resolution of the problem for Calvin was that Abraham's faith was to cling utterly to God's faithfulness, despite evidence against it, and entrust to God how to work out that faithfulness. It was not his business to do it. He entrusted entirely God's business to do it. Luther thought Abraham came to believe in the resurrection. Calvin didn't think that at all. Now, Kierkegaard comes along, centuries later, and Kierkegaard sees this. Oh, I should say, Calvin saw it simply as a matter of problem of faith. Kierkegaard sees it a problem of faith and the moral problem together. For Kierkegaard, faith has two elements. The one is, it's an utterly personal, very particular devotion of one person, Abraham, to another the person of God. And this utter devotion entails what he calls infinite resignation, that is, utter and complete and unconditional giving up of everything else in the world. What he loves, what he appreciates, everything has to be submitted to and given up in order to adequately serve and express his devotion to God. On the other side, nevertheless, he must remains fully engaged in the world. This, Kierkegaard said, is absurd. It's a contradiction, and that's the contradiction at the heart of faith. He takes this and talks about the moral problem, and he says, God's command pits faith against ethics. Faith, utter devotion to God, requires Abraham to be committed to God, and if that requires, as he says, suspending the ethical, then it's suspended. It's a suspension of the ethical in the name of faith. And because the ethical is the universal and communicable to others, because this ethical has been suspended, Abraham has no way to justify his act to anyone else. And so his act is utterly incommunicable. He is thrown into utter solitude. On the other hand, he gives up the ethical, suspends it, but this is the contradiction, he lives fully committed to morality too. And that's the absurdity of faith. Again, you live a life of contradiction. I guess that's the summary from there. And what's interesting, I guess, and Rabbi Graber will take this up, is that in the late 19th and through into the early 20th century, a number of important Jewish writers picked up some parts of, or all, or whatever, of Kierkegaard.
Big trimmer thing, you're not interested in that, are you?
No, not really.
All right, so I'm gonna pick up from here. I did hear a little bit of background noise, so somebody's not on mute, so please try to be. Thanks, Jerry. And so let me pick up from here. And what I want to do, well, first I want to say hi, Joe Harvard. I saw you called me. I've had a crazy day, but I love you and just wonderful to see you. And now I want to say what I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes or so is to try to walk through the arguments in the second part of the book that are at least Kohler's way of trying to resolve some of these questions. And then I think Jerry is going to sort of go back over those 5 questions and see, what do these help with and what do they not help with? And we want to leave the second half of today's session, hopefully at least the last half hour, for conversation and just to hear from each other. Okay, so that's what we'll try to do. As Jerry said, Kohler lays out in the book, there are a number of Jewish sources from the late, from the 19th century and some 20th century who seem to follow in Kierkegaard's footsteps. He labels some of them as Jewish followers, and when he does so, it indicates that there is pretty reasonable information that these people had read Kierkegaard. And then others are called Jewish parallels, where there's less evidence that these thinkers had read Kierkegaard, but they are parallel and reflecting 19th century, 18th century philosophy. Maybe they had read Kant, or maybe they were just sort of smelling what was in the air, but they were swimming in these intellectual currents. One of the, and I'm just going to give a few of these examples. The first one, the first Jewish source is a thinker named Malbim, Rabbi Yechiel Levush. who is, I think, from Poland and the 19th century. And in his commentary on the binding of Isaac, I've excerpted a little something here, but he says explicitly, and I'll just go ahead and read this. Everything, he's asking a question. By the way, let me just take one step back. You will rarely find traditional, in modern times, there are Jewish philosophers who will write articles, but a lot of the time when you want to find what Judaism has to say about this or that, the way that you find it is by looking at commentaries on the Torah or commentaries on another text. And that's how philosophical ideas get developed. Not necessarily in a treatise, but more in a commentary on a text. So here, we mentioned last time that Abraham turns to the servant or to the servants and says, you sit here or you stay here with the donkey, okay? And the question is, why does he why can't the servants come along, right, as part of the ride? And this is what Malbim says. He says, everything Abraham did until now did not violate his intellect. In other words, everything, the servants have been part of Abraham's life up until this point. And up until this point, everything that Abraham did made sense. It was rational. It fit into ethical categories. But the Malbim says, now that this command to sacrifice his son, which violated his intellect and violated God's good ways. So the Malbim is being very explicit here. When God says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son, that is not ethical. This is a violation of ethics, okay? And when this command comes to Abraham and it violates God's good ways, when that reached him, he did not want to fulfill it in front of his servants, for he was ashamed to do something in front of them that until now he had held to be an abomination. So it's remarkable, right? There's no attempt here to try to sugarcoat it, to try to say that this fit within some sort of rational scheme or some sort of ethical scheme. You really do have a reflection of the Kierkegaard's approach that this was a temporary teleological suspension of the ethical. Now, Leibovitz is a 20th century, sorry, I just opened something I didn't mean to open. Leibovitz is a 20th century modern Israeli philosopher who actually did write more essays and treatises, and who certainly had read Kierkegaard and had read Kant and others. He's writing in the 20th century in modern Israel. And he expands this for what Kierkegaard says is a temporary suspension of the ethical. Leibovitz actually develops a whole philosophy of religion that places religion and ethics in two different categories, right? This may sound bizarre for us, and it is a strange philosophy, but he would say that ethics is one sort of set of thinking, and religion is about a different set of thinking. And Leibovitz actually says that the more that religion focuses either on it's not that religion is unethical, but it is, it's not that religion, I guess you would say unethical, and it's not teaching you to do bad things, but it's not related to ethics. It's aethical, right? Maybe that's the right way to put it. And he actually says, I'll give you one of his more famous statements is that when you pray, that praying from the prayer book should be the same thing as praying from the phone book. In other words, the content of your prayers is actually absolutely irrelevant. And the more that it means something to you, then the more that you have corrupted your devotion to God. That religion is specifically about following God's will, and anything that sort of distracts you from that is, in his vision, a dilution and even a contamination of pure religion. And so Leibovitz, writing about this, and the quotation is from pages 68 and 69 in the Kohler book, he writes as follows. He says that when he's reading Abraham's life, he actually reads the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham argues against God and argues that God is asking something unethical. He views that as a mistake. Okay, and I'll read you the passage. He says, this error of assuming God is bound by ethics at Sodom and Gomorrah is corrected in the story of the Akedah. Here, God asks Abraham to do something grossly immoral. And when Abraham fulfills the immoral divine command, showing that he understands that obedience to God necessitates the abandonment of all ethics, right? You can hear Kierkegaard in there, right? That this moment of faith necessitates the willingness. For Kierkegaard, it's temporary. For Leibovitz, he's actually going to say this is what true religion is all about. The abandonment of all ethics, God commends him as one who fears God. Now, by the way, I'll just take a second to point out, one of the challenges that we have to confront in this text is the end. We may, as moderns, want to say, how could Abraham do that? But we have to confront that at the end of it, God actually says to Abraham, because you have feared God, I bless you, right? In other words, there's some sort of commendation at the end. And Leibovitz says God commends him as one who fears God. In other words, that's what the true fear of God is. The Akedah then, the binding of Isaac, then is the episode in which Abraham learns the lesson that for Leibovitz is the archetype of all true religion. True devotion to God takes no heed of human considerations, even of basic moral judgments. While Kierkegaard spoke of only a suspension of the ethical, Leibovitz seems to think that the ethical has been permanently canceled by religion. Okay, it's a stunning reading. And one other Jewish sort of parallel and follower is Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, one of the most important formative thinkers of modern Orthodox Jewish thought. I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, I'm a conservative rabbi. Soloveitchik was a very important figure in Orthodox Judaism in the 20th century. And for him, the Akedah it's not only this, but it's actually a model for prayer where every time that we pray, right? So he's a little bit less than Leibovitz. For Leibovitz, it's a model of all true religion. For Soloveitchik, every time we pray, right, we should be aspiring to essentially enter into the mindset of Abraham when Abraham goes through the Akedah, right? So, Jerry talked about it, the temporary suspension of the ethical. It's temporary, but it's like temporary 3 times a day, like because traditional Jews pray 3 times a day. You're supposed to reenact the Akedah 3 times a day. Soloveitchik writes, the law of sacrifices demands the sacrifice of a human in the form of an animal. So here he's trying to explain the sacrificial system. And at least one theory for Jewish prayer is that the Jews pray 3 times per day as an echo of the sacrifices of animals that were made in the temple. And then the question becomes, what was the psychology of the sacrifice of an animal? And the psychology of that was essentially that you sacrifice the animal there, but for the grace of God go I. Right? In other words, the sacrifice of the animal was the substitute for the sacrifice of the human being. He says, the spirit of man clothed in the body of an animal is sacrificed to God. Build an altar, arrange the pieces of wood, kindle the fire, take the knife to slaughter your existence for my sake. Right? Thus commands the awesome God who suddenly appears from absolute seclusion. This approach is the basis of prayer. Man surrenders himself to God. He approaches the awesome God, and the approach expresses itself in the sacrifice and akedah of oneself. Okay, so here are three. We've now quickly sort of seen three different Jewish thinkers from the 19th century and 20th century, for whom the akedah is certainly taken as a model, and very disturbingly is taken as a model either for true religion or for something that is, very regular, which is for praying. Okay, so that's Kierkegaard's influence on modern Jewish thought. Okay, and where this leads you, Errol, somebody put in the chat, Errol Zeiger, but religion is the basis or defines the ethics and morality of a society. And all I can say is that Leibovitz would say, yeah, ethics is important, but it's not related to religion, right? Ethics is something that you can derive not from a revealed tradition, but through human reason, through rationality, through universal things, but it's not related to a revealed tradition. So what I want to do next, and this is where I really want to, let me just say, David, you said if for Leibovitz faith to God supersedes ethics, morality, then what is the source of morality? I just gave you some examples. Okay, I'm not saying it's great. I'm not a follower of this, but I do think there is a way, and Jerry can probably speak to this more. There certainly are ways outside of religion to construct a philosophical basis for morality. Okay, and Leibovitz was one of those. What I want to focus on is, and you may not want to work through the entire book, but if you do work through some of the book, the chapters that I commend to you are the last chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7, which are Kohler's chapters on child sacrifice and on Maimonides. Okay, but if you don't want to do it, I'll walk you through those today. Okay, that's what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so, probably 20 minutes. So the question becomes, if I need to take this text seriously, okay? And what I want to just remind us is whenever we're wrestling with hard texts, you can say, well, that's a difficult text. That doesn't have a claim on me, okay? And I'm setting it aside, and I'm going to go to another text that has more of a claim on me. And in the modern era, that is, I think, a perfectly reasonable approach. However, if you want to make a difference, I would say, in preventing the radicalization of religion, then that's not an approach that can work, because religious people are claimed by religious texts. We're claimed by them. We hold them as authoritative. And so the question becomes, how do I take seriously this text and answer the problems that are raised by the text, but not be led down the path of, and I think Kierkegaard's reading, part of what Kohler is getting at in the overall book, is that his reading has the potential for great danger, for people saying, I've been seized by the moment and I'm going to suspend the ethical and I'm going to do terrible things, right? So how do you have a reading of the Akedah that takes seriously the text of the Akedah and allows you to feel claimed by it, but that doesn't lead you to these very problematic conclusions. And he presents what I think is a fascinating reading. And the first step of that reading is understanding why it is that a moral and ethical God can ask for Abraham to sacrifice his child, okay, to sacrifice Isaac. And what he goes about showing is that in the time of the Bible, child sacrifice was kind of normal, and it was pretty popular. And that may feel very bizarre for us, but there are very good reasons why child sacrifice was so popular. And for those of you who are writing in the chat, I don't mind, but I'm not going to be answering questions, and I can't actually multitask that way, okay? So first of all, how do we know that child sacrifice was popular? I'm going to pull up a source, and he walks you through these, but I'll pull up a source from the Torah. Okay, in the Torah, the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. This is in the middle of the account of the Exodus. There's in the middle of the story, right before the last plagues, the narrative shifts over to a set of laws and mitzvahs, ways that the Exodus is to be remembered. And God says, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast, the first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. And why is this recalling the Exodus? Because the 10th plague involves the death of the firstborn. And when God says, consecrate to me the firstborn, God is essentially saying, I did you a big favor. I killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, and that helped to set you free. And there's a debt which is owed to me, right? Because that helped to set you free. And the debt that you're going to pay me back with is you're going to consecrate to me the firstborn, right? Now, and look at what it says, of every man and beast, and the first issue of every womb. And in modern Judaism and in ancient Judaism, right, this was never applied to literally killing the firstborn. This was ritualized into a process where the priests would receive 5 silver shekels, and then parents would, it was called the redemption of the firstborn, right? You would receive 5 silver shekels, and then your firstborn child was your own, and the priests accepted that upon God's behalf. But the plain sense of this can very easily be read as, your firstborn child belongs to God, right? And I'm going to show you another just example of this. Later on in Exodus, we read, you shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats, right? In other words, don't take it for yourselves. You shall give me the firstborn of your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day, you shall give it to me. And so here again, you seem to have some evidence that what God is asking for, out of a sense, is either the firstborn of animals, the first of your crops, or the firstborn of human beings. And then the question becomes, why would the sacrifice of a child be so popular? And by the way, in terms of its popularity, I want to read to you on page 117. Kohler recounts just some of the history of the ancient Near East. And I'm just going to read to you a small passage. He says the Tophet, a Tophet is essentially a place, a cemetery. It was a place where where bodies were found, the Tophet in Carthage, the largest and best studied, apparently contains tens of thousands of children interred from the 8th through the 2nd centuries BCE. So from the 8th to the 2nd centuries BCE, in some centuries, these were interred at a rate of 2 per week. So 2 children per week were sacrificed and interred in this Tophet in Carthage. Repeated study has shown that this Tophet mostly contains children between 1 and 6 months old, clustering around a month and a half. So the sacrifice of children was a regular part of the ancient Near East. And while it's anathema to us, it was part of what happened in the ancient Near East. And the question becomes why? And there are 2 answers to that. Number one is that, as we saw in those sources, since God did this for us, right, offering your first child as offering your first fruits and offering the firstborn of a flock was seen as a measure of gratitude, right, of a debt that you owed and as a way of saying thank you to God. And it was also understood, if you think about Leibovitz's understanding of pure religion, there was something very pure about sacrificing your child, specifically because you loved your child and you didn't want to give up your child. No parent wants to give up their child. And so it was a way of proving your sort of piety and your faithfulness to God was to give your child specifically because it was very difficult and you didn't want to. So Kohler begins with the assumption that when God says to Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, that there's a part of God, and this is very technical, so just follow me for a moment. There is a part of God that actually desires and appreciates child sacrifice. Okay, there's a part of God that appreciates and desires child sacrifice. Okay, but then you have the question of that's not where the story ends. And this is something that often gets lost, and Kohler points this out, that remember that there are 2 divine commands that are part of this story. And Kierkegaard actually doesn't pay very much attention to the second divine command. The second divine command is, don't do it, right? Stop, right? The story isn't just the opening verses. There's a second divine command which says, stop, I don't want you to do this. And how do we reconcile these 2 divine commands? And to do so, he brings the reading of Maimonides. Maimonides is a very, very important Jewish sage from the Middle Ages, who wrote in the Guide for the Perplexed as follows. And this is really, I have to say, I think, a brilliant reading of the Akedah. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Hold on for 1 second. I'm not sure. Yeah. So at the bottom here, I've brought you Maimonides, just a couple of passages. Let me share my screen. Where Maimonides, let me first tell you about this. Maimonides describes prophecy, okay? And he says that prophecy is not something that God takes God's will and pours it into the head of the prophet, right? And the prophet has the experience. Prophecy is actually something that human beings achieve through a process of self, for lack of a better term, self-improvement, right? You prepare yourself ethically and intellectually and emotionally to ascertain God's will in the world. And good prophets are people, David, I'll come to that in a minute, okay? Good prophets are people who who achieve a certain level of human excellence. And this is important to understand how it's working, because Maimonides is not saying that God changes God's mind at the end of the Akedah, okay? Maimonides is going to argue that Abraham becomes a better prophet as the story goes on. If you remember, Leibovitz says that Abraham gets worse between Sodom and Gomorrah and the Akedah, and Maimonides is going to say it moves in the opposite direction. How does this work? Okay, so hopefully you're still with me. He says that the seventh level of prophecy, okay, is, can you all see this? Okay. So Leslie, will you read, it's just a little sentence here, but will you come off of mute and just read the seventh level of prophecy for Maimonides?
Sure. The seventh level that he sees in a prophetic dream, as if may he be exalted, speaks to him.
Okay, so the seventh level of prophecy for Maimonides is when a prophet sees in a dream that God is speaking to you. Okay, now why is that important? I'm gonna go up here for a moment. Okay, let me ask you, when you read the Akedah, okay, I'm gonna read this to you. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, "Here I am." He said to him, "Take your son," etc., etc. And then verse 3 says, "So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass." Okay? So verses 1 and 2 are the communication, and verse 3 says, early next morning, right? In the Hebrew, Vayashkom Avraham baboker, Abraham gets up early in the morning and saddles his ass. Based upon that, when would you assume that the communication of verses 1 and 2 takes place?
Night.
At night. Okay? And presumably, Abraham is going to say, the indication here is that this is a dream. That God appears to Abraham in a dream and says, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. That's a dream. And then Abraham wakes up the next morning, having had this dream, and sets about following God's will. So for Maimonides, this is Abraham is experiencing seventh level prophecy, which is in a dream. The highest level, except for Moses, okay, is the 11th level. Leslie, would you read the 11th level?
The 11th level, that he sees an angel speaking to him, like Abraham at the time of the Akedah. That is, in my view, the highest level of prophets that the books testify about their states.
Okay, meaning prophets, right? All prophets. So for Maimonides, the highest level is not when God appears to you in a dream, but when you're awake, you're real live awake, just like you and me, and an angel speaks to you. And I will remind you, right, that when it comes, some of you asked about this, the Akedah begins with God, and in Hebrew it's Elohim, speaking to Abraham, and then it switches. At the key moment, right, what do we read? An angel of Adonai, an angel of the Lord, calls out to Abraham from heaven and tells him to stop. Okay? And what Maimonides is going to argue is that Abraham has understood God in the beginning of the Akedah, but has not, and has understood God correctly, because there is a part of God that wouldn't mind a child sacrifice, but the deeper, the higher level of understanding is that God doesn't want child sacrifice. Okay, this may sound strange, so let me repeat it again. And I want to read you how Kohler explains this in his book. Okay, but again, at the beginning of the Akedah, when God says, please sacrifice your son, right? There's a part of God that likes child sacrifice because it means that nobody's forgetting the fact that I did something nice, right? And redeemed the Jewish people from Egypt. And it's a very pure form of relating to God. And so there's a part of God that really appreciates it. But Abraham has misread the situation, not because he didn't hear God correctly, but he didn't hear God completely. Okay, and here's, I want to read you the passage where Kohler explains this. It's on page 139 in the book, if any of you have it at home. Okay, it is certainly a psychological commonplace for a person to want something, but to not want it even more. Okay, and I have to say, I love this example. Consider a health-conscious person, raise your hand, right? If you've ever had this feeling, looking at a piece of cake, okay? We all have had this experience. Go down to the refrigerator, right? And you see the piece of cake. You may want the cake, right? But you won't end up eating it on a good day, okay? Right? Now, the rejection of the cake is a statement not of its despicability or fundamental abhorrence. In other words, you're not saying, oh, that piece of cake is horrible. You know, and I know that cake tastes really good. And you would love to have that cake. However, even though there's a part of you that would love to have the cake, right? The rejection of it is a desire for health that is even more powerful than the desire for confection. And so what Maimonides is arguing is that the larger part of God doesn't want child sacrifice, but there is a smaller part of God that does. And Abraham, at the beginning of the Akedah, only heard the part of God that wanted the piece of cake and had not yet reached the level of prophecy to fully understand that God in the end does not want child sacrifice. Okay, let me leave you, I'm going to finish in a moment, okay, but I want to just walk through the last part of Kohler's argument, okay, because part of what he demonstrates, and I'm going to share my screen and just show you one other set of texts from the Torah. Part of what he demonstrates is that the Torah moves from the Torah. This is part of a larger pattern in the Torah. Before we walk through that text, I want to read you something. In the Hammurabi Code, okay, in the Hammurabi Code, we read as follows, and if you have your book at home, you can find this on page 145. In the Hammurabi Code, which actually precedes the Bible, we read that if a builder builds a house for a person and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls and kills its owner, then the builder shall be put to death. And if it kills the son of the owner, the son of the builder shall be put to death. Okay, let me just, in plain English, okay, if I'm a contractor and I build a home, and the owner, the son of the owner gets killed because of my negligence, according to the Hammurabi Code, my son would be, the just thing to do is that my son would be put to death as recompense. Okay, now what's the logic behind that? The logic behind that is that my son is actually a legal extension of me. In other words, my son is not an independent agent who should only die for his own sins, right, and his own mistakes. My son is actually part of my property and therefore can be taken from me as a recompense for my mistakes. When the Bible teaches this law, the Bible teaches it almost identically, but with one key difference. Okay, and I'll share my screen. In the Torah, it says, and this is like a little bit different. It's not about the builder. It's about an owner. If you have an ox, which is also part of your property, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is not. Okay, forget about that part. If the ox has been in the habit of goring and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it, and it kills a man or a woman, okay, the ox, which is your property, and its owner shall be put to death. Why? Because you're negligent. You knew that your ox was a misbehaving ox, okay? If ransom is laid upon him, he must pay whatever is laid upon him to redeem his life. And so too, if it gores a minor, male or female, okay? This is the key part. The owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. What's the same rule? It's a fine. It's not that your own child is put to death. In other words, if something under your jurisdiction ends up killing a minor, it's not that your child is put to death, it's that you have to pay a fine. And the movement between the Hammurabi Code and the Bible is the movement between seeing the child as an extension of your legal property to seeing your child as their own individual human being. And what Kohler argues is that when the Bible says God would like child sacrifice, but more, God doesn't want child sacrifice, it is moving away. It's the Bible here, and I'm going to finish up in 2 minutes, Jerry. The Bible here is countercultural. This is where the Bible is making a change to the norms of the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, children are an extension of your property. They're an extension of you, and you sacrifice them because that's the greatest way that you can show your love for God. The Akedah is the movement away from that. God says, I don't want your child because it's arising out of a worldview. It is changing the idea that children are the way that you can, are just extensions of yourself. And it's rejecting the idea that you can have a relationship through God by sacrificing another human being. It is rejecting the idea that you can have a relationship with God by sacrificing another human being. And that, in the end, is Kohler's deep argument here. The deep argument is that it is a misreading, that Kierkegaard's reading and that the Jewish sources that I've quoted are misreadings of the significance of the story of the binding of the Akedah, because they don't pay attention to the fact that Abraham is not the one being sacrificed. Isaac is. And you can't ignore the fact that Isaac is sacrificed, and that the ultimate lesson of the story is that we may not have a relationship with God, a pious or faith moment that depends on the death of another person or the suffering of another person. And that is his way. I'll just finish by saying, I think what's very important, again, as moderns, we may set this aside and say, I just reject the whole idea. But within religion, we have to have a way of reading this text that takes the text seriously, but also doesn't lead you down this very dangerous path of irrational faith and faith that is so private that it can't be checked against the through the, I think, the healthy discourse with a community. Let me now turn it back over to Jerry. I hope that was clear enough and helpful.
Good. We'll get to conversation quick soon. I want to just do two things. First, recall the 4 problems, or 5. There's no question that this interpretation has tried to be as honest to the text as possible. That's what Daniel was just emphasizing at the end. There is a faith problem, but the problem is solved. I mean, Abraham is an exemplar of faith, although it takes a while for him to figure out just what faith requires. And what's really interesting about the Kohler interpretation is that faith is not opposed to morality. Faith is not opposed to the ethics. But the whole interpretation turns on 2 important other pivots. The one is a theological claim. God wants stuff, but he's conflicted about it. And he wants some stuff more than others. That you might call, that's the answer to the question, what do we learn about God? Well, God sometimes wants stuff and then he doesn't want it.
So Jerry, Jerry, let me just,
Yeah.
I'm going to tweak that a little bit, because it's not that God sometimes this and sometimes that, because Maimonides would be very concerned about saying that God changes God's mind.
Yeah.
His description is not, it's not temporal. It's that God has many aspects of God's will that stay the same, but only become accessible to us human beings through the development of our abilities.
Yeah. Okay. So that softens the theological puzzle some. And so it makes the real pivot of the interpretation the claim about 2 levels, several levels, but relevant here, 2 levels of prophecy. That is 2 levels of our access to, or our understanding of God's will. That's the real pivot of it.
Right.
And so it looks like we've got answers to these problems that are pretty much in line, but very different from Kierkegaard. Let me just secondly add a reflection on this that I think is no doubt inflected by my Christian understanding, but is somewhat along the lines of Kohler's reading as well, but without the appeal to prophecy. So here's another way of reading that whole story. Abraham finds that he needs somehow or other to prove to himself and to God his devotion. And he sets out then, understanding that there being a command, we can worry about that some other time. He sets out with an understanding of what that involves. Given that he's living in a culture in which child sacrifice is the ultimate expression of devotion, he goes to sacrifice his son, though he loves him dearly. It's an expression of that. He goes up to the top of the mountain, draws the knife, and he's stopped. And the angel says, don't do that. And one way to take that, which I want to pursue, is God through the angel says, that's not what devotion amounts to. That's not what faith requires. I won't say that God has conflicting but desires. I want to say that God says here, Abraham, you're doing in one sense the right thing, but in the wrong way. You're doing it the wrong way because you think that expressing your devotion fully to me, God says, is through sacrifice. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake not just of conforming to the culture of the world. It's a mistake because you've misunderstood my full nature, says God. What is my nature? My nature is to love everything I created, especially all my creatures, and especially all my human creatures. I love them all. And what you thought when you experienced love to me, you experienced my love to you, you thought it was exclusively yours. And that's a kind of idolatry. What we have to learn is that God loves everyone infinitely, but not exclusively. And so you've made a mistake about faith by making a mistake about what God's love amounts to. What faith requires is always asking, in cases where you wish to or find the need to express your devotion, how that relates to the needs, rights of other people. So morality and faith are not in conflict. They are intimately connected.
So I'm going to just jump in for one more second, and I really appreciate your offering that reading, and I want to say that I probably disagree, and it probably is a very, one of those places where Christianity and Judaism are going to approach things a little differently, because I think the result of that, Jerry, would be letting go of the entire sacrificial system. In other words, the Bible then, then even sacrificing an animal, right, would be a misreading of what it is that God wants. But we have an entire book of Leviticus, and for thousands of years, there is a sacrificial system. Now, look, Maimonides himself will say that the sacrifices were for their own time, etc., and that we move beyond those. So it's not that Judaism is interested. I'm not interested in, and conservative and Reformed Jews are not interested in reestablishing the sacrificial system. Some Orthodox Jews are, and some are not, but they still leave the prayers that way because that's the way they approach the tradition. But I don't think that I would read it as, I don't think I would go as far as you did in terms of reading it as a.
So one way of putting that challenge, Daniel, is how come we had to have the ram in there? The ram doesn't, and that supports your reading of it, that there is. So one could put my view a little bit differently. God loves all human beings, so that we never sacrifice. We never think that it's a demand of our faith that we act in such a way as that is both self-sacrificial and sacrifices the rights, the important lives, whatever, of other human beings.
There we are 1,000%.
Right. Yeah. So our environmentalist friends would have problems with this, but so we should open this up to conversation.
Okay. So one thing I saw, David, I saw that you put into the chat a question about why, David, do you want to just read it, or why doesn't God tell Abraham at the end himself? You're on mute, David.
Yeah, the question was, why does God not deliver the second command himself? After all, he didn't deliver the first via a messenger. And actually, I think you answered that, or Maimonides answered that, in terms of talking about different levels. That's certainly one response to that.
Right. And I think, there are two elements to the answer. One of them is Maimonides' notion of prophecy, right? Which again it's a very different notion of prophecy than we are used to. We are used to prophecy
being that the prophet receives a divine message from outside of himself or herself. And for Maimonides, God's truth is actually in the world. It's almost like science. A scientist learns how to read nature, right? Better and better. And so the prophet actually rises in terms of understanding. But to your point in the story, the beginning, when Elohim appears to Abraham at the beginning in a dream, that's actually a lower level than the angel speaking directly. Whereas because it's a messenger, we would, I think intuitively our sense is, oh, that's a lower level than the speech at the beginning of the story. And it's why, and you don't have to buy it, but Maimonides has a text, something in the text which indicates to him that the first communication was in a dream, right? I mean, and when I read it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Abraham was asleep, and God speaks to him in a dream, and then I think it is a higher level of what we think of as prophecy to be spoken to while you're awake, right? While you're awake, even if it's by a messenger of God, it's happening while you're awake as opposed to while you're in a dream.
One might ask the question, if we said earlier that Abraham did not do this in front of the servants because he was ashamed to carry out that act, might one also say that at the end, God is ashamed of what he has done, and God comes to realize that it's wrong, and not being able to confess to that shame himself, he sends a messenger?
Good. That's why I like to take my view, which is just a problem of Abraham understanding things, and not a problem with God.
Right. I think Maimonides would disagree with you, but I think it's another plausible and important and creative reading.
Well, I think because you've heard me say this before, I have great difficulty with this text. And one of the things that I've thought of, and the more I think about it, the more I think it's an appropriate way to look at it, is Abraham comes from a milieu where there are many gods. And he has been chosen by this God to walk in this God's way. And Abraham is not yet sure about it. And this passage, it says that God is testing Abraham, but to my mind, Abraham is also testing God. And what we have here is a cosmic game of chicken. And ultimately, Abraham says, I'm going to test you. I'm going to see if you really mean this. And ultimately, God blinks. And when God blinks, Abraham showed that he was willing to do it. So he passes God's test. But God's blinking shows that God also passes Abraham's test.
So I don't mean to be a stick in the mud, okay? But again, I would say to you the challenge of your reading is that at the end, God says to Abraham, not because you did withhold from me your son, right? That's why I'm blessing you and you did a good job. No, God says to Abraham, because you did not withhold your son from me, that's why I'm giving you the blessing. So the text itself, again, I hear you, but the text itself is speaking, going in a different direction. And I think that I'm not telling you that it's the only reading, but I think the strength of Maimonides' reading is that it's reconciling the truths in the text, and I think almost all of them in a comprehensive way.
Was somebody there?
No.
I thought it was on the computer, and I think
Probably
so.
was.
If somebody, Richard, if you could go on mute, or if our controller can, that would be good. Other reactions, thoughts?
Yeah, Annette.
You're on.
Yeah. Okay. So despite Maimonides' reading, which maybe solves this specific individual act and problem. It's very problematic to me that we have the view that we maintain the view that faith requires that we obey these words and God's teaching no matter what, and even when it seems to conflict with morality. And I'll throw out, like, one of the things I always liked was the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and thinking of Israel as those who wrestle with God, that we are not blind followers and believers, but we say, wait, that we challenge this. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm looking for a response to that.
So one reason why my reading takes the direction it does is it says it gives us the lesson when we believe we're following the will of God to achieve some very important expression of faith. If that involves a serious compromise of the good or the rights of others, we have to second guess it. We have to take a second look. That's enough for us to say, I don't know whether this is consistent with what I know God to be throughout a larger part of Scripture or the like. And so this is not a matter of giving up on this story, but rather what God says to Abraham is, I understand you wanted to express your devotion. That was the right thing to do, but not that way. And then we can then try to better understand what God wants us to do. But so that one of the things, Daniel, you and I talked about earlier, some weeks ago. How about all those people who say we can, I don't know, plant bombs or refuse to serve or all these kinds of things in the name of expressing our devotion to God? And the message, I think both of us are saying, Kohler and you and I, that's got to be tested.
Right. I want to be very clear, right? Part of why I appreciate Kohler's reading is because it takes this text seriously, and ultimately, from within the text itself, says that the sacrificing another is a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Right? And then actually, and it makes it a larger claim, which is that the biblical worldview, right, not just the Akedah, but that the Akedah is part of the biblical worldview, which is moving you away from the idea that your child or that your wife or that another human being is just chattel who can be enlisted for your religious purposes, right? It's arguing, it's saying that fundamentally, if you read the Bible that way, you're misunderstanding the way that the Bible was functioning in the ancient Near East. I think the little pushback, right, let me try to tease out this difference, however. And Joe, I'd love to hear your thought on this. I think that the challenge is one of ego, okay? Because if at any point, right, your religious faith is going to lead you to sacrifice someone else, that's a clear problem, right? And that's the guardrail. But on the other hand, if there need to be parts of our religious life which also challenge us and make us uncomfortable. In other words, where we're not only arguing with God, but we're also listening. Because the danger is that if we're only arguing, then we're actually just constructing our own religion, and we're making God in our own image rather than listening. And so I don't think we should be listening, and then that lets us go and abuse other people or kill other people, God forbid, right? But on the other hand, I don't think we can always have the the stance of Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? In other words, I think that there is that the authentic religious personality both contains a sense of struggle and also a sense of listening and even surrender. And I've spoken in other settings about how for Jews, that sense of what are the times where I'm going to allow myself to be coached, if I can use some language from my childhood, right? Where I'm gonna listen and sort of allow myself to be told something by this tradition outside of myself. I think it's a tough place, for Jews. And I would just argue it's both are part of the whole package, in the way that both are part of the package for God as well.
Yeah. So let me just mention, Joe, I'd like to have you, if you want to respond. Leslie and Arrow both have questions too. So Joe, do you have a response?
Well, yeah, I do. It seems to me a part of what's one interpretation means to take the whole story seriously and to say, if there's anything clear in this story, is that Isaac was a gift. Sarah was beyond the way of women when Isaac came. God is God's gift to him. So the question that is put before Abraham is, are you worshiping the gift or are you worshiping the giver? And that, let's be clear here. I'm the giver and Isaac is the gift. But, in the end, and I guess what kind of saves the story for me is he recants his command. And I like Jerry's interpretation. He was a little ashamed of his recanting, so he sent a messenger. But I mean, the whole idea to keep it in the context of the whole story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac seems to me it's important.
Leslie?
So if Kohler is right, and this is God's way of moving us away from thinking that child sacrifice is okay, then how do we reconcile that with the 10th plague on Egypt, where God decides to kill all these innocent children to make his point? And maybe that's too far afield from this talk, but I find it very troubling that that God would send that message in the way he sent it to Abraham and then do what he did in Egypt.
Right. So
in Egypt, Pharaoh decided what the 10th plague would be.
Well, not exactly. And let me just say this, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that the 10th plague was needed, and he didn't have to have hardened Pharaoh's heart. He could have had Pharaoh be inclined to let the Israelites go after the 9th plague, where there'd been a lot of suffering already.
Yeah.
It's a brutal message, but is it not possible that what's happening with regard to the 10th plague is that God is demonstrating what are the consequences of brutalizing other people? That if you brutalize other people, you yourself are going to be brutalized?
Well, a lot of those kids that got killed weren't brutalizing anybody, nor were their parents.
So let me say a couple of things. I think that the question that you're raising, there is a distinction, right? Which is God is making clear to human beings what is, in the story of the Akedah, right? That child sacrifice is off the table. However, there's in the story of the Exodus, God is, what your point is that God is not playing by the same rules, right? And I think it's a fair point. I would just say they're different, right? In other words, God making clear to human beings, you're not allowed to worship me this way, is a different question than God deciding for God's self, I am going to kill some innocent Egyptian children, right? For the sake of, for the larger purpose of the, for the larger purposes of the Exodus, right? So I think that there are two different things. I think when God kills the Egyptian children, right? Some of it is yes, they're part of a society that was, that was overall guilty, and there are these larger purposes, but some of it is they're, okay, yeah, you're right, they're innocent, and God is sort of deciding, I'm gonna sacrifice some innocent children for these larger purposes. God apparently is allowed to do that, right? At least at that point in the story, or at that point in the Torah, and is speaking out of both sides of God's mouth, right? But we've all had that experience of kids, right, where we say to our parents, hey, you're being a hypocrite, right? And I think it's a reasonable thing to say to God, but I still think that God's answer might be, I'm telling you what's not okay for you. However, there's a bigger piece that I'm trying to achieve that you don't understand, right?
So Virginia has a question about Isaac, but Errol, let's get to your question first.
Hey, going back to the, Abraham arguing with God at Sodom and Gomorrah when he had no investment, no major investment in it. And it's almost at the beginning of the Akedah, if God is remembering that that Abraham was an argumentative person and is challenging Abraham to argue with him. Take your favorite son, no comment. Isaac, no comment. The one that you love. He's almost begging Abraham to say, wait a minute. Why are we doing this? Because he asks it with Sodom and Gomorrah, but he doesn't ask it with his own son.
Yeah.
So
there's an interesting reading.
Abraham failed that initial test in a way.
So there's an interesting reading that suggests that the reason why Abraham didn't raise the question in the Akedah time was that when he challenged God at Sodom and Gomorrah, he learned that God was amenable to understanding, as it were, collateral damage. He knew that God was already committed to justice. And so he thought, God can't be really demanding this, because demanding something that's inconsistent with that kind of thing. He learned already, Abraham did. So this reading goes. My own view is more along the ones that Daniel and you suggested, and that is, there's left open the question of whether this is God's will I'm listening to. Virginia, one thing Virginia asked is, how come Isaac doesn't figure very prominently in here? You want to say something about this, Virginia?
Well, I think number one, it's interesting that we all seem to assume that Isaac was a child, and he may not have been. I mean, I think the rabbis have put his age at, and Daniel can correct me, but 26, 34, maybe 13, but even 13 is maturity. So Isaac needed to have an agency of some sort here. The other thing is that Isaac is one of the patriarchs, and the patriarchs generally have a covenant moment of some sort. And perhaps this is Abraham's, but Isaac sort of is ignored in the Akedah and most treatments, and then we go on, and a couple of chapters later he marries Rebecca, and all we know about him is that he enjoys making love to this beautiful woman that he takes into his mother's tent, and then later he's deceived by his own sons,
and you can argue that he was traumatized by this experience, but what if Isaac knew in fact what was going on and accepted the possibility of his own sacrifice, and that was his covenant moment?
So that's the reading that, oddly enough, you get from Protestant, especially Calvin commentary. He was convinced, we don't know why, that Isaac was in fact quite a bit older. And the reason why Isaac must have been going along with this voluntarily is that he could have easily resisted Abraham and just said, no way, but he didn't. And so that was, through the silence of the text, an indication of Isaac's agency. It also is important for Christian analogical, or what should we say? What's the right word here?
Analogical.
Yeah, I guess analogical reading of it. Allegorical is what I wanted, allegorical reading, where this was an act of father and son, willing act of father and son. That's how that part of the Christian tradition developed it. But there's some hint of that sort of thing in the amongst the Jewish writers as well. And it's critical for the Islamic interpretation of it.
Well, and part of what happens in Judaism, the whole story is called Akedat Yitzchak, which means the binding of Isaac, and it's obviously not labeled that in the Torah, but it becomes known that in the Jewish tradition, typically only in the context of Judaism's relationship with Christianity. In other words, when Christianity starts to see it as an allegory, then Judaism starts to see Isaac as the hero of the story, as its own sacrificial figure. In some ways saying we don't need Jesus because Isaac, had this. Isaac had this moment of self-sacrifice. So each of them sort of claimed in that way. And what's interesting is that Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard's reading returns, it erases Isaac from the story. And Kohler says at some point that in Kierkegaard's reading and the Jewish parallel readings as well, Abraham becomes the sacrificer and the sacrificed, right? In Kierkegaard's reading, Abraham is the one who is being sacrificed by sacrificing his will and his love for his child and his sense of ethics. And it's like, wait, where's Isaac in the story, right? And so, I think Kohler's reading and certainly many Jewish readings return the focus to Isaac, and to the fact that Isaac is being sacrificed.
Spencer made a comment in the chat when apropos of our discussion earlier about what about the ram, and you remember, Daniel, that you and I at that point had to exclude our environmentalists from the story and just focus on human beings. And Spencer, what you said was something like, well, maybe that was a temporary moderating gesture. Is that right?
More like an incremental step toward
That's right.
non-sacrifice.
Yeah. I'm reminded that the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai has a poem called "The True Hero of the Akedah is the Ram." Though I never quite understood that. Maybe someone could help me with that. But he picks out the ram, not Isaac and not Abraham, but the ram is the hero.
Well, I think he's saying because the ram is the one who ends up dying. In the end, we maybe we make ourselves feel better because Isaac doesn't end up dying and Abraham doesn't end up doing it. Yeah. But there's a ram who had who had a long day, right? You know,
And that reminds me of Wilfred Owen's poem that goes something like sacrificing their children on and on and on, about the madness of the First World War. He uses the Akedah as an example again. The ram of pride, sacrificing it for the good of the ram of pride, we went on and sacrificed our children on and on and on.
Right. And by the way, Israeli, I don't know if it's Amichai so much, but Israeli poets, the Akedah sort of figures in Israeli poetry a lot.
Really?
In reflecting on the loss of children in war, in many of Israel's war.
Yeah.
Joe put a question in the chat for how I would preach about this. And I think what I would say is I want to, and this will be my concluding part. And Jerry, if you want to, after that, wrap up, for yourself, I would just go to, as an academic, he's not going to sort of expand a lot on this, but there are a couple of places at the very beginning and the very end where Kohler, I think, hints at where he sees his work situated in terms of the larger cultural agenda. And on page, if you have the book, it's on page XXXII, page 32 of the introduction. And if you don't, I'm just going to read this to you for a second, because I think he makes some very important points here. He says, in the broader Western discourse of law and policy, he argues we also live in a Kierkegaardian world. The courts have exempted religious organizations from providing their employees with health plans that even so much as authorize a third party to provide contraceptives. This is said to violate, quote, their freedom of religion. The New York City Board of Health announced an insistence on vaccinations for all children attending preschool and daycare programs. Children with a valid religious exemption will not be required to be vaccinated. Kohler argues such an understanding of the freedom of religion derives from Kierkegaard's notion that for a religious person alone on the mountain, even ethics must be put aside for faith. For Kierkegaard, Abraham being alone with God on the mountaintop is critical to understanding the religious point of the story, which is the fundamentally personal nature of faith, the incommunicability of religious devotion, the zealousness of the faithful that takes precedence even over one's own moral compass. Right? And Kohler is arguing here that Kierkegaard's understanding of religion as a fundamentally private and fundamentally incommunicable project, that has actually very much impacted the Western, the society in which we live, where somehow your right to religion, right? Your right to your faith can excuse or not be tested against societal understandings of ethics. And I think he's arguing that that's dangerous, right? And we need to be careful of a vision of religion which is too individual and which is somehow can possibly be excluded from the tests of social discourse. And he writes at the very end of the book, he says that it is all well and good to celebrate the personal and individual faith that animates some people's lives, but a society cannot afford to allow individuals' sense of religious devotion to take precedence over the welfare of others. Okay, that to me is the preaching moment. Okay, Joe, and I'll just read it one more time. A society cannot afford to allow individual sense of religious devotion to take precedence over the welfare of others. Right? To me, the beauty of this reading is saying, you know what, faith, if it is something that lives in, inside of you, that's fine, but it does, when you live in a society, your faith has to be testable and it has to be open to critique, and it can never come at the expense of people around you and the society that you live in.
Now, Rabbi, that's indeed what drew me to our conversation originally, that part of it. And so all the details and twists and turns of interpretation shouldn't obscure what seems to me to be the most fundamental point. I want to just end with two really minor points. That's the major one. Running through the Christian interpretation of this is the theme that gets picked up from Abraham's reply to Isaac when he says, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham says, "God will," and in these usual interpretations are, "God will provide." What I'm told is that that's provide is a rendering of the Hebrew. You can help me on this. But provide comes from the Latin providere, that is to look ahead. So in effect, what Abraham is saying is God's going to look forward. And the seeing theme runs all through this. And nothing I've said, and actually nothing we've said here, picks up on the crucial seeing. Abraham comes and sees the Mount Moriah and sees the ram. That seeing is really important all the way through. And I haven't been able to factor that in, but it seems to me it's pretty important. And it certainly was for a lot of early Christian interpreters. The other thing is, I worry about, one thing that I appreciated about Kierkegaard is that he took the whole problem really seriously. And he was almost reveling in anguish. And we've kind of washed the anguish out. But imagine being Abraham and coming down the mountain and having to reconcile to himself, perhaps to Isaac, and then Sarah, that he just about killed his son on a mistake. He intended to kill his son, and it was just luck that got him out of it. That's got to do damage to one's sense of oneself and surely one's relationship to family. But we don't think about that very much. Although your story at the very beginning of our conversation today about Sarah suggests that maybe Sarah did. You can imagine him coming home and saying, "I'm sorry, hon, I know I was going to kill him, but I was mistaken and lucky he's not dead." And she would say, "You did what?" Right? Perhaps her soul left her then. That's all I have to say, and I think that's probably our time is up.
Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Yeah.
I hope that our communities, Mindy was here last time, and Joe, good to see you. And I hope that our communities can find other opportunities to come together and not only to study, but to do acts of righteousness and goodness for our local community. And we hope everybody gets a vaccine as soon as possible. And we hope that you stay safe and healthy. And we wish everybody just only good things as we go through this.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Joe,
Thank
good to
you.
see you again.